The winter of 2018 arrived early in Kaesong, bringing with it winds so cold they seemed to cut through even the thickest military coat. Lee Jun-seong, then 34 years old, stood at the window of his office on the third floor of the Political Security Department building, watching snowflakes dance in the dim streetlights below. The building itself was one of the few in the district that received consistent electricity, a privilege reserved for organs of state security. From this vantage point, he could see the darkened silhouettes of residential blocks stretching toward the horizon, their windows mostly black, punctuated only occasionally by the weak glow of candles or oil lamps. Jun-seong had served in the Political Security Department, known colloquially as the Bowibu, for nearly 12 years by that point. He had risen through the ranks with a combination of ideological fervor, sharp analytical skills, and an unwavering commitment to the principles he had been taught since childhood. His father, a decorated veteran of the Fatherland Liberation War, which the outside world called the Korean War, had instilled in him a fierce pride in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and an absolute loyalty to the supreme leader. His mother, a devoted member of the Socialist Women's Union, had reinforced these values with stories of American atrocities and the constant threat posed by the puppet regime in Seoul. The Bowibu was not merely a police force, it was the immune system of the state, identifying and eliminating threats to the body politic before they could metastasize. Jun-seong's division focused primarily on ideological contamination, monitoring citizens for signs of wavering loyalty, investigating rumors of forbidden foreign media consumption, and interrogating those suspected of harboring counter-revolutionary thoughts. It was demanding work, often morally complex. But Jun-seong had convinced himself it was necessary. The Republic was surrounded by enemies, he believed, and only constant vigilance could preserve the revolutionary gains achieved through the blood and sacrifice of previous generations. His desk was typically organized with military precision reports arranged by urgency in neat stacks. His officer's cap positioned at exactly the right angle. His pen and notepad aligned perfectly parallel to the desk's edge. On this particular evening in late November, however, something disrupted that order. A brown envelope sat slightly askew atop his primary stack of documents, marked with a red stamp indicating priority investigation required. The contents would prove to be the first hairline crack in the edifice of belief that Jun-seong had spent his entire life constructing. The case file detailed the activities of a small work unit at the Kaesong Industrial Complex, the now shuttered Inter-Korean Economic Zone, that had once represented a rare point of contact between North and South. According to the report, submitted by an informant within the unit, several workers had been discovered discussing rumors about life in South Korea, based on information gleaned from leaflets that had drifted across the border. Such leaflets, known as PPIRA or propaganda flyers, were regularly launched by activists and defector groups in the South, carrying messages and images designed to undermine faith in the northern regime. Standard protocol in such cases was clear. Identify the primary distributors, determine the extent of the ideological contamination, extract confessions, and recommend appropriate punishment. Jun-seong had handled dozens of similar cases over the years, yet something about this particular file troubled him in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. Perhaps it was the specific details mentioned in the workers' conversations, descriptions of abundance, freedom of movement, and access to information, that struck a dissonant chord with the narrative he had always accepted about the South being a living hell of American imperialism and capitalist exploitation. 3 days later, on November 27, 2018, Jun-seong found himself at a collection point near the military demarcation line. Supervising the gathering of PPIRA that had been scattered by a recent balloon launch from the south. The area was restricted, accessible only to security personnel and designated collection teams. The weather remained bitterly cold, and his breath formed clouds in the air as he watched. Junior officers use long poles to retrieve leaflets caught in trees and bushes. The standard procedure was to collect these materials without reading them, seal them in designated containers, and transport them for proper disposal. But as Jun-seong reached up to pull a leaflet from a low-hanging branch, his eyes inadvertently scanned the glossy surface. The image stopped him mid-motion. It showed what was purportedly a street scene in Seoul-wide. Clean boulevards lined with tall buildings whose windows blazed with electric light, cars of various colors moving in orderly traffic, and people, ordinary people, dressed in clean, fashionable clothing, carrying shopping bags, their faces reflecting not the desperate struggle for survival he had been taught to expect, but something that looked disturbingly like contentment, even happiness. The text accompanying the image claimed that South Korea had the 10th largest economy in the world, that its citizens enjoyed freedoms of speech and assembly, that they could access any information they wished through something called the Internet, and that no one starved there. Jun-seong had been trained to recognize such claims as lies, sophisticated enemy propaganda, designed to weaken the revolutionary consciousness of the Korean people. Yet the photograph itself, the quality of the print, the casual affluence evident in every detail, planted a seed of doubt. He quickly folded the leaflet and placed it in the collection bag. But the image remained burned into his mind. That night, lying in his small apartment, he found himself unable to sleep. His wife, Min-ji, had taken their daughter to visit her parents in Pyongyang. So he was alone with his thoughts. The apartment was cold, heating fuel was rationed even for security officials. And he lay under heavy blankets, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image from the leaflet over and over in his mind. Over the following weeks, Jun-seong found himself increasingly attentive to certain details in his work that he had previously processed almost automatically. When interrogating citizens accused of watching foreign media, he listened more carefully to their descriptions of what they had seen. One man, a factory worker in his 50s, described a South Korean drama in which ordinary working people lived in homes with multiple rooms, owned automobiles, and took vacations to foreign countries. The man had wept during his interrogation, not from fear of punishment, but from what he described as heartbreak, the realization that he had spent his entire life in deprivation, while people across an arbitrary border lived in comfort. Jun-seong had written in his report that the subject showed signs of severe ideological corruption and recommended re-education. But privately, he had begun to wonder if the South was truly a hellish place of exploitation and misery. Why did exposure to its media have such a powerful effect on people? Why did citizens risk their lives and the safety of their families just to watch these programs? Why did the state need to invest such enormous resources in preventing its citizens from accessing information about the outside world? In December 2018, Jun-seong was assigned to a case that would accelerate his ideological crisis. A small USB drive had been confiscated from a university student in Kaesong, containing South Korean television programs, news broadcasts, and even some content from the wider world, American films, BBC News reports, and Japanese variety shows. The student had already been arrested, and Jun-seong's task was to trace the distribution network, identifying everyone who had possessed or viewed the materials. The interrogation of the student revealed a sophisticated system. USB drives were copied and passed hand to hand through networks of trusted individuals, each person watching the contents alone or with family members before passing it along. The student himself had received the drive from a friend who had connections in Pyongyang, where foreign media was somewhat more accessible, due to the presence of diplomats and the relative prosperity of the elite. As part of his investigation, Jun-seong was required to view the contents of the USB drive himself, to understand what exactly had been distributed, and to gauge the severity of the ideological threat. He took the drive home one evening when Min-ji and his daughter were again away, connected it to his personal computer, a luxury item he had received as a reward for excellent service, and began to watch. What he saw over the next several hours fundamentally altered his understanding of reality. The South Korean dramas were not crude propaganda pieces, but sophisticated productions showing ordinary people navigating ordinary problems, family conflicts, workplace dynamics, and romantic relationships, against backdrops of obvious material comfort. The news broadcasts reported on government corruption and political protests, showing citizens freely criticizing their leaders without apparent fear of retaliation. Most shocking were the international news segments showing perspectives on North Korea itself. Footage of defectors describing their reasons for escape, reports on human rights conditions, and satellite images showing the stark difference in nighttime illumination between North and South Korea. Jun-seong watched until dawn, his mind reeling. He felt as though he had been living in a carefully constructed theater set, and someone had just torn down the backdrop to reveal the vast world beyond. Every news broadcast, every scene of daily life in Seoul, every casual display of abundance and freedom directly contradicted the foundational narrative of his entire life. If this were enemy propaganda, it was remarkably consistent and detailed. And if it wasn't propaganda, if it was simply reality, then what did that mean about everything he had believed, everything he had done in service of those beliefs? The most devastating realization came when he watched a news report about North Korean defectors settling in the South. The reporter interviewed several people who described their lives in the North: the chronic food shortages, the surveillance state, the mandatory participation in political rallies, and the public executions designed to instill fear. Jun-seong recognized every element they described because he lived within that system. These were not lies or distortions. These people were telling the truth about their experiences, and those experiences perfectly matched his own reality. Which meant that their descriptions of life in the South might also be true. He sat in the growing morning light, feeling physically ill. As a Bowibu officer, he had helped maintain the very system these defectors described with such pain and anger. He had interrogated people for the crime of seeking truth, recommended punishments for those who dared to question the official narrative, and believed himself to be a guardian of righteousness and justice. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. In the days that followed, Jun-seong went through the motions of his work mechanically. But he felt as though he were two people: the loyal officer performing his duties, and a secret skeptic observing everything through newly opened eyes. He noticed how the official newspapers never reported bad news about the Republic. Only triumphs and achievements that somehow never translated into improved conditions for ordinary citizens. He noticed how questions about policy were discouraged, how curiosity itself was treated as suspicious. He noticed the fear in people's eyes during interrogations, not the fear of criminals facing justice, but the fear of victims facing an arbitrary and overwhelming power. By January 2019, Jun-seong had made a tentative decision: he needed to see more. He needed to confirm whether what he had witnessed on that USB drive represented reality or an elaborate deception. But accessing foreign media was extremely dangerous. especially for a security officer who would be held to the highest standards of ideological purity. Discovery would mean not just his own destruction, but the punishment of his entire family under the Songbun system of collective responsibility. He began cautiously, testing the waters. During an interrogation of a merchant accused of trading in foreign goods, Jun-seong asked seemingly professional questions about sources and distribution networks. But he was actually mapping out how such networks operated. He struck up conversations with colleagues he judged might harbor their own doubts, carefully probing their attitudes with hypothetical questions about loyalty and ideology. Through these careful inquiries, he eventually made contact with a fellow officer, Kim Tae-il, who worked in the same department but in a different section. Tae-il was 3 years younger than Jun-seong, also married with children, and had a reputation as a competent but not zealous officer. Over several weeks, through carefully coded conversations, they discovered they shared similar doubts. Tae-il had also seen forbidden media through his work and had been similarly shaken by the experience. In February 2019, the two men made a dangerous pact: they would secretly obtain and share foreign media, educating themselves about the outside world and trying to determine the truth. They both understood the enormous risk. If discovered, they would not merely lose their positions, they would face imprisonment in political camps, likely along with their families. But the hunger for truth had become overwhelming. They had glimpsed a reality beyond the narrow confines of their previous worldview, and they could not unsee it. Over the following months, Jun-seong and Tae-il carefully accumulated foreign media files, passing USB drives between them, watching alone in carefully secured moments, and occasionally meeting in remote locations to discuss what they had learned. Each new piece of information reinforced the same conclusion. The outside world, and particularly South Korea, bore no resemblance to the hellish landscape described in official propaganda. While certainly not perfect, the South was a prosperous, modern democracy, where ordinary people enjoyed freedoms and opportunities that seemed almost fantastical to someone raised in the North. The psychological burden of this double life was immense. Jun-seong continued to perform his duties, interrogating suspects, writing reports, and attending political study sessions where he recited the required slogans and expressed the expected enthusiasm for the supreme leader's guidance. But inside, he felt hollow, fraudulent. He was enforcing a system he no longer believed in, punishing people for seeking the very truth he himself now pursued. His relationship with his wife became strained. Min-ji noticed his distraction and frequent absences, the way he would stare into space during meals, the way he flinched at unexpected noises. She asked several times if something was wrong, if he was in some kind of trouble. He desperately wanted to tell her, to share his discoveries and perhaps escape together, but the risk was too great. If she reacted badly, if she reported him out of loyalty to the state or fear for their daughter's future, everything would be lost. By the summer of 2019, Jun-seong had reached a critical juncture. The knowledge he possessed had become a burden he could barely sustain. He knew too much to continue living as before, but not enough to formulate a clear escape plan. He was trapped in a liminal space between the world he had always known and a world he could only glimpse through smuggled videos and forbidden texts. The decision that would ultimately propel him toward defection came not from increased knowledge but from increased risk. In late August 2019, Tae-il sent an urgent message through their covert communication channel. They had been careless. Another officer had noticed Tae-il watching something on his computer and asking suspicious questions about power supply schedules, questions that might indicate he was trying to find safe times to use electronic devices without detection. Although Tae-il had managed to deflect immediate suspicion, both men understood that they were now potentially under observation. The fear that followed this realization was unlike anything Jun-seong had experienced before. In his work, he had seen what happened to security officials suspected of disloyalty. The investigations were thorough, relentless, and merciless. Even if they destroyed all physical evidence, a determined investigation would likely uncover something. Informants were everywhere. Computer usage could be traced. Even casual comments made months earlier might be re-examined and reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion. Jun-seong lay awake night after night, his mind racing through scenarios. If they were arrested, his daughter would grow up in a political camp, branded as the child of a traitor, deprived of any chance for a normal life. His wife, who knew nothing of his activities, would still be punished under the principle of collective responsibility. His elderly parents would likely be imprisoned as well. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the fear. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Jun-seong first allowed himself to consider defection seriously. The thought had crossed his mind before, but he had always dismissed it as fantasy, too dangerous, too complicated, too final. But now, with potential exposure looming, it transformed from fantasy to necessity. If he was going to be punished anyway, why not take the enormous risk of trying to reach the south? At least then there would be a chance, however slim, of survival and freedom. The next time he met with Tae-il, in a remote area outside Kaesong where they sometimes conducted surveillance exercises, Jun-seong raised the possibility. The conversation was brief and conducted in carefully euphemistic language, but the understanding was clear. Both men had arrived at the same conclusion: they had crossed a threshold from which there was no safe return. They could either wait passively for discovery and certain destruction, or they could attempt the seemingly impossible escape across one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. As the autumn of 2019 approached, Jun-seong began to prepare psychologically for what lay ahead. He looked at his daughter with new eyes, memorizing every detail of her face, knowing that if he survived the escape attempt, he might never see her again. He watched his wife moving through their apartment, and his heart broke with the knowledge that he would have to abandon her to protect her. If he defected alone and died in the attempt, she could claim ignorance and perhaps escape the worst punishment. If he told her and she came with him, their daughter would be left orphaned and tainted by her parents' betrayal. Every morning, Jun-seong dressed in his Bowibu uniform. The same uniform he had once worn with pride, and it felt like a costume for a role he could no longer play convincingly. He went through his duties mechanically, trying not to think about the people he was interrogating, the reports he was writing, the system he was perpetuating. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, present in body but absent in spirit. The breaking point came suddenly, without warning, on a cold morning in late September 2019. Jun-seong arrived at his office to find colleagues gathered in hushed, urgent conversation. Tae-il had been arrested the previous night. The charges were not yet clear, but the arrest had been conducted by a special team from Pyongyang, which suggested serious political crimes. Jun-seong felt the blood drain from his face as the implications crashed over him like a wave. If Tae-il broke under interrogation and everyone broke eventually, Jun-seong's own arrest would follow within days, perhaps hours. He maintained his composure through sheer force of will, nodding solemnly. With his colleagues, expressing shock and disappointment that a trusted officer could potentially harbor counter-revolutionary thoughts. Inside, his mind was racing, calculating, planning. He had perhaps 24 hours before Tae-il's interrogation yielded his name, maybe less. All the careful preparation he had imagined making for an escape attempt would have to be compressed into a single desperate day. That evening, Jun-seong returned home as usual. Embracing his daughter, sharing dinner with his wife, performing the rituals of normal family life one final time. After his wife and daughter had gone to bed, he sat alone in the darkness of his small living room, listening to their breathing from the adjacent bedroom. The temptation to wake them, to confess everything, to beg Min-ji to come with him was almost overwhelming. But he knew that any attempt to escape with his family would almost certainly fail. The border security was too tight, the surveillance too complete. A lone man, especially one with his training and knowledge, might find a way through. But a family? Impossible. Instead, he wrote a letter, brief and cryptic, that Min-ji would find after he was gone. He told her he loved her and their daughter more than life itself. He told her she had done nothing wrong and that any crime was his alone. He begged her to protect their daughter, to claim complete ignorance of his activities, to denounce him completely if questioned. He signed it simply with his name, folded it, and left it in a place where she would find it but not immediately. Just after midnight, Jun-seong changed into dark civilian clothes, took what little cash he possessed, and slipped out of his apartment. The city was quiet, the streets mostly dark. He moved through them like a shadow, heading south, toward the military demarcation line and the sea beyond. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. Every distant sound made him freeze. He expected at any moment to hear shouts, to see flashlights cutting through the darkness, to feel hands grabbing his shoulders. But the night remained still. Jun-seong walked on, leaving behind everything he had ever known: his family. His identity, his entire life stepping forward into uncertainty and terror and the slim, desperate hope of freedom. The fracture that had begun with a single leaflet on a cold November day had finally split completely, and there was no going back. As he reached the outskirts of the city, where the buildings gave way to fields and the first military checkpoints began, Jun-seong paused for one last look back at the dark silhouette of Kaesong. Somewhere in that darkness, his daughter slept, dreaming innocent dreams. He whispered a farewell that only the night wind heard, then turned south and continued walking into the unknown. The industrial outskirts of Kaesong on that September night in 2019 were wrapped in an eerie silence that seemed to amplify every sound Jun-seong made. Each footstep on the gravel road, each breath of cold air he drew into his lungs, felt magnified in the darkness. The moon was only a sliver, which he considered fortunate. Less light meant less chance of detection by the patrols that regularly swept these areas. As a political security department officer, he knew the patrol schedules intimately, had even helped design some of them. Now that knowledge, accumulated over 12 years of loyal service, would be turned against the very system he had once protected. Jun-seong moved carefully along the edge of the road, staying close to the sparse tree line that separated the industrial zone from the agricultural fields beyond. His mind kept returning to the events of the past 6 months, the cascade of decisions and discoveries that had brought him to this desperate moment. The weight of what he was leaving behind: his daughter's smile, his wife's quiet strength. His parents' aging faces pressed down on him with such force that several times he had to stop, steadying himself against a tree, fighting the urge to turn back. But there was no going back. Tae-il's arrest had closed that door forever. By now, probably within the last few hours, interrogators in Pyongyang would have begun their work on his friend and colleague. Jun-seong had witnessed such interrogations countless times, had even conducted some himself in his earlier years. He knew the techniques: sleep deprivation, stress positions. The psychological pressure of knowing that resistance was futile, that eventually everyone confessed. Tae-il was strong, but no one was strong enough to withstand what awaited him. Within days, perhaps even hours, he would give Jun-seong's name. The machinery of state security would then turn its attention to finding and destroying another traitor in its ranks. The sequence of events that had led to this night had begun innocuously enough, back in March 2019. 4 months after Jun-seong had first watched the forbidden content on the confiscated USB drive. The psychological impact of that viewing had been devastating, but also transformative. For weeks afterward, he had moved through his duties in a fog of confusion and doubt. Everything he observed: the propaganda broadcasts, the mandatory political study sessions. The fear in citizens' eyes during interrogations took on a different character when viewed through the lens of his new knowledge. It was during this period of internal turmoil that Jun-seong had begun to cautiously reach out to Tae-il. Kim Tae-il worked in the Economic Crimes Division of the Bowibu, focusing on black market activities and unauthorized trading with China. They had known each other for years, had shared meals in the department cafeteria, and had attended the same political education courses. But they had never been close friends. The culture of the Bowibu discouraged deep personal relationships, as such connections could compromise operational security and objectivity. Their first real conversation had occurred in early March, during a joint operation targeting a suspected smuggling network. They had been assigned to conduct surveillance together, spending long hours in a cold vehicle watching a warehouse on the northern edge of Kaesong. The boredom and isolation of surveillance work naturally led to conversation, and Jun-seong had carefully, almost experimentally, begun to probe Tae-il's views. "Do you ever wonder," Jun-seong had asked, keeping his tone casual, "why people risk so much to watch foreign media? I mean, if it's truly just propaganda and lies, why does it have such power over them?" Tae-il had been silent for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the warehouse through binoculars. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "I think people are curious. They want to know what's being hidden from them. Human nature, perhaps. But what if," Jun-seong had continued, his heart racing at his own audacity, "what if it's not all lies? What if some of what they show about life in the South is actually true?" Another long pause. Then Tae-il lowered the binoculars and turned to look directly at Jun-seong. In his eyes, Jun-seong had seen a reflection of his own doubt and fear. "That," Tae-il had said quietly, "is a very dangerous question, comrade." "I know," Jun-seong had replied. "But I can't stop asking it." That conversation had been the beginning. Over the following weeks, through careful and coded exchanges, they had discovered they were kindred spirits, both intelligent men who had been shaken by exposure to forbidden information. Both struggling with the cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught and what they had observed. The relief of finding someone who understood, who shared the burden of dangerous knowledge, had been immense. By April 2019, they had begun actively seeking out foreign media together. It was Tae-il who had suggested they could use their positions to acquire materials more safely than ordinary citizens. "We're the ones who confiscate these things," he had pointed out during one of their carefully arranged private meetings. "Before we log them into evidence and send them for destruction, who would know if we made copies?" It was a brilliant and terrifying idea. The Bowibu's own procedures created a window of opportunity. Materials were catalogued and destroyed. But there was typically a delay of several days between confiscation and disposal. During that time, items were stored in evidence rooms with relatively light security. As it was assumed that Bowibu officers themselves were above suspicion of wanting to access such materials. Their first joint acquisition had been in late April. Jun-seong had been assigned to process evidence from a raid on a boarding house where several residents had been arrested for watching South Korean dramas. Among the confiscated items were 3 USB drives containing dozens of video files. Following standard procedure, Jun-seong had catalogued the drives and placed them in the evidence room. noting in his report that they would be destroyed within the week. But the following night, working late when few other officers were present, he had returned to the evidence room, used his access credentials to enter, and connected one of the drives to his laptop just long enough to copy its contents onto a separate drive he had brought for that purpose. The risk had been extraordinary. If anyone had walked in, if the security cameras had been reviewed for any reason, if any small detail had gone wrong, he would have been finished. His hands had shaken so badly that he had twice fumbled the USB connection. But the transfer had completed successfully, and he had left the evidence room with a drive in his pocket containing what felt like a bomb, dangerous, powerful, and capable of destroying everything if mishandled. That evening, at Tae Il's apartment, while his family was away visiting relatives in the countryside, the two men had watched together. The content was a mix of South Korean television dramas, variety shows, and news programs. Each show was a revelation. The dramas depicted everyday life in Seoul with such casual detail that it was impossible to believe it was all staged propaganda. People lived in apartments with multiple rooms, heating that worked consistently, and kitchens filled with food. They owned cars, smartphones, and computers. They went to cafes and restaurants as casual entertainment, not as rare treats for special occasions. One particular drama had struck Jun-seong with particular force. It followed the life of a single mother working as a clerk in a large company, struggling to raise her son, while dealing with an overbearing mother-in-law and financial pressures. What had shocked him wasn't the plot itself, but the mundane details of their lives. The mother's small apartment was larger and better appointed than the quarters of high-ranking officials in Pyongyang. Her financial struggles involved deciding whether to buy her son the latest model of smartphone or wait a few months. The boy attended a well-equipped school, had access to unlimited internet, and spent his free time playing sophisticated video games on devices that seemed impossibly advanced. "This can't all be real," Tae Il had whispered as they watched. "This level of abundance. It's impossible." But the news programs had confirmed it. They showed street scenes, shopping districts, subway systems, all filmed in a documentary style that was difficult to fake. They showed political protests where citizens openly criticized the president, demonstrations that the police monitored but did not violently suppress. They showed entertainment programs where comedians made jokes about the government without apparent fear of retaliation. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. This was not propaganda but documentation of a reality so different from their own that it seemed like science fiction. Over May and June of 2019, Jun-seong and Tae Il had acquired and watched dozens of hours of content. Each viewing session had deepened their understanding and intensified their sense of having been deceived their entire lives. They began to discuss what this knowledge meant for them, what they should do with it. Should they keep it to themselves, living with the burden of a hidden truth? Should they try to slowly red pill others, spreading awareness carefully? Or should they consider the option that seemed both most logical and most terrifying: defection? It was Jun-seong who had first raised the possibility during a tense conversation in early June. They had been sitting in Tae Il's car in a remote area outside the city, ostensibly conducting surveillance on a suspected Chinese smuggler. "What's the point," Jun-seong had asked, "of knowing the truth if we can't live in it? We're like prisoners who've discovered the cell door is unlocked, but choose to stay inside because we're afraid of what's beyond." Tae Il had gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "You're talking about defection. Do you understand what that means? We'd have to leave everything: our families, our identities, our entire lives. And the chances of success. Jun-seong, we both know the statistics. Most defection attempts fail. And when they fail, it's not just death for the defector. It's a punishment for 3 generations of family. I know, Jun-seong had replied. But what's the alternative? Continue living a lie? Continue being part of a system we now know is built on deception and oppression? How long do you think we can maintain this double consciousness before we break? They had left that conversation unresolved, but the seed had been planted. Both men had begun, almost unconsciously, to gather information that might be useful for an escape attempt. Jun-seong had started paying closer attention to border security procedures, patrol patterns, and the geography of potential crossing points. Tae-il, whose work frequently took him to areas near the Chinese border, had begun mapping out routes and identifying potential weak points in the surveillance network. But even as they gathered this information, both men had hesitated to take the final step. The barriers were enormous, psychological as much as physical. They had families, children, and parents. They had positions of relative privilege in a society where privilege was scarce. They had identities, purposes, lives that, however compromised by their new knowledge, were still real and meaningful. The prospect of abandoning all of that for an uncertain future in a foreign land was almost paralyzing. The decision had been made for them by circumstances beyond their control. In late August, Tae-il had become careless. The pressure of maintaining his double-life loyal Bowibu officer by day, secret consumer of forbidden media by night had begun to wear on him visibly. He had lost weight, become irritable, and developed insomnia. His wife had noticed and had begun asking questions. At work, he had made small errors that, individually, might have gone unnoticed but collectively had begun to form a pattern. The critical mistake had occurred during a routine inspection of his division's evidence room. Another officer had entered unexpectedly while Tae-il was reviewing materials on his computer. The other officer had been too far away to see the screen clearly. But he had noticed Tae-il's startled reaction, the too quick minimizing of the window, the flash of guilty fear across his face. It might have been nothing. Everyone had private matters they preferred not to share with colleagues. But in the paranoid culture of the Bowibu, nothing was nothing. Everything was potentially significant. Tae-il had called Jun-seong that evening, using a carefully coded message they had developed. I think I might be coming down with something. Maybe you should avoid me for a while, so you don't catch it. Jun-seong had understood immediately. Tae-il was potentially compromised, which meant Jun-seong was now at risk as well. For the next 3 weeks, Jun-seong had lived in a state of heightened anxiety, expecting at any moment to be called in for questioning. He had destroyed his copies of the foreign media, had reviewed everything he had said and done over the past months, trying to identify any behavior that might appear suspicious in retrospect. He had mentally prepared responses to potential questions, had even practiced maintaining composure under stress. But as the days passed without incident, he had begun to hope that perhaps the danger had passed, that the other officer had dismissed his suspicions, that Tae-il's momentary lapse had been forgotten or attributed to innocent causes. It was a desperate hope, born of the desire to believe that the comfortable fiction of his life could continue, that the reckoning could be indefinitely postponed. That hope had been shattered on the morning of September 24, 2019, when Jun-seong had arrived at work to find the department in turmoil. Tae-il had been arrested during the night by a special security team from Pyongyang. The charges hadn't been formally announced, but the nature of the arrest, conducted by an outside team, executed at night without prior warning, indicated serious political crimes. Within hours, security protocols had been tightened throughout the department. All officers were instructed to report any suspicious behavior they had observed from Tae-il over the past year. Computers and files were being audited. The atmosphere was thick with fear and suspicion. Jun-seong had mechanically participated in the investigation of his friend and co-conspirator. Had even contributed to the timeline of Taeil's activities, carefully omitting any mention of their private meetings and conversations. Inside, he felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. He knew interrogation techniques. He knew that within days, possibly hours, Taeil would reveal everything, not out of disloyalty but out of simple human limitations. No one could withstand the kind of interrogation that awaited him. That evening, Jun-seong had gone home as usual, had played with his daughter, had eaten dinner with his wife, had performed all the rituals of normal family life while his mind raced with calculations and plans. After his family had gone to bed, he had sat alone in the darkness, facing the impossible choice that now confronted him. If he stayed, arrest was virtually certain. His only questions were when and how much his family would suffer along with him. If he ran, he might die in the attempt, but at least there was a chance, however slim, of survival and freedom. And if he succeeded in defecting alone, his family might be able to claim ignorance, might escape the worst consequences of his betrayal. The choice, when he finally made it, felt less like a decision and more like a surrender to inevitability. He could not stay and wait for destruction. Human nature rebels against such passive acceptance of doom. He had to try, had to reach for that slim possibility of survival, even if the attempt itself was almost certainly suicidal. And so, just after midnight on September 25, 2019, Jun-seong had left his home for the last time. He had stood in the doorway of his daughter's room, watching her sleep, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her small hand curled around her blanket. He had gone to the bedroom where his wife slept and had stood there in the darkness, listening to her breathing, fighting the overwhelming urge to wake her, to confess everything, to beg her forgiveness for what he was about to do. Instead, he had left the letter he had written, a pathetic and inadequate explanation for the unforgivable act of abandonment he was committing. Now, 3 hours later, he moved through the darkness on the outskirts of Kaesong, heading south toward the military demarcation line and the sea beyond. The temperature had dropped further, and his breath formed clouds in the air. He could hear the distant sounds of the city behind him, the occasional bark of a dog, the rumble of a truck on a distant road, but ahead there was only darkness and silence. Jun-seong knew the terrain ahead with painful intimacy. As a Bowibu officer, he had participated in operations along the DMZ, had studied maps and satellite imagery, and had interviewed people who had attempted to cross and failed. The border itself was a death trap: minefields, electric fences, watchtowers equipped with thermal imaging cameras, and patrols that operated on unpredictable schedules precisely to thwart escape attempts. A direct crossing of the DMZ was essentially impossible. But the coastline offered a different possibility. West of Kaesong, the land met the Yellow Sea at a series of mudflats and marshes. The maritime border was patrolled, but less densely than the land border. If he could reach the coast without detection, if he could find or steal a boat, if the tides and currents cooperated, if he wasn't spotted by coastal patrols, if he didn't die from hypothermia in the cold water, there were so many ifs. Each one representing a point of potential failure. He might be able to reach South Korean territorial waters. The plan was barely a plan at all, more a desperate hope stitched together from scraps of information and powered by pure survival instinct. But it was the only option available, and so Jun-seong walked through the night toward an uncertain coast, and an almost certainly fatal attempt to cross the sea that separated his old life from the possibility of a new one. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky behind him, Jun-seong increased his pace. He needed to reach the coastal area before full daylight, when his presence would become much more difficult to conceal. His feet ached, his legs trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline, but he pushed forward. Behind him lay everything he had ever known and everyone he had ever loved. Ahead lay only the cold sea and the slim, desperate hope of freedom. There was no going back now. There was only forward, into the growing light and whatever fate awaited him beyond the horizon. The first light of dawn on September 25, 2019, crept across the horizon like a threat. Jun-seong had been walking for nearly 5 hours, and his body screamed with exhaustion. The industrial outskirts of Kaesong had given way to agricultural land, then to increasingly wild terrain as he approached the coastal region west of the city. He had avoided roads wherever possible, cutting through fields and wooded areas. Constantly alert for the sound of vehicles or voices that might indicate patrol activity. By his calculations, based on maps he had memorized during his years of service, he was now approximately 3 kilometers from the coast. The landscape had changed dramatically in the past hour. The cultivated fields had been replaced by scrubland and marsh grass, and the ground beneath his feet had become increasingly soft and waterlogged. The distinctive smell of tidal flats, a mixture of salt, mud, and decaying vegetation, filled his nostrils. It was a smell he associated with patrol operations he had conducted in this region years earlier. Back when he had been hunting people attempting exactly what he was now trying to do himself. The irony was not lost on him. As the sky continued to brighten, Jun-seong's sense of urgency intensified. He needed to find cover before the sun rose fully. In daylight, any movement in this sparsely populated area would be visible from considerable distances. The coastal region was classified as a restricted military zone, with observation posts positioned at irregular intervals along the shoreline. Civilians required special permits to access these areas, and anyone found here without authorization was automatically suspected. Jun-seong spotted a dense thicket of bushes and small trees about 200 meters ahead. Situated on slightly elevated ground that rose above the surrounding marshland. He made his way toward it, his feet squelching in the increasingly muddy terrain. By the time he reached the thicket, his shoes and the lower portion of his pants were caked with thick, gray mud. He pushed into the vegetation, ignoring the branches that scratched his face and hands, and found a spot near the center, where the growth was thick enough to provide concealment but open enough for him to observe his surroundings. He sat down heavily, his back against the trunk of a gnarled tree, and allowed himself to rest for the first time since leaving his apartment. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and his heart still pounded from the combination of physical exertion and sustained fear. He pulled a small bottle of water from his jacket pocket, one of only 2 he had brought, and allowed himself 3 small sips. He had no idea how long he might need to make his supplies last. From his position, Jun-seong could see a considerable expanse of the terrain ahead. The mudflats stretched toward the sea, creating a landscape of grays and browns punctuated by pools of standing water that reflected the brightening sky. In the distance, perhaps a kilometer away, he could make out the thin line where land met sea. Even from this distance, he could see that the tide was currently out, exposing vast expanses of mud that would make any approach to the water treacherous and highly visible. He would have to wait. The tide tables, which he had memorized months ago during a coastal security operation, indicated that high tide in this area would occur around 7 o'clock in the evening. That meant he had roughly 12 hours to wait before he could attempt to reach the water. 12 hours of hiding, of forcing himself to remain motionless despite the fear and anticipation that made every minute feel like an hour. As he waited, Jun-seong's mind turned inevitably to what was happening back in Kaesong. By now, surely his wife had awakened and found him gone. She would have discovered the letter, read his inadequate explanation, and his desperate plea for her to denounce him completely. He tried to imagine her reaction, the confusion, the fear, the betrayal she must feel. He had abandoned her and their daughter without warning, without giving her any choice in the matter. Leaving her to face the consequences of his decision alone. The guilt was almost physically painful. He found himself composing mental apologies, explanations he would never be able to deliver. He imagined his daughter asking where Daddy had gone, imagined his wife trying to explain the inexplicable. The image of his daughter's confused, hurt face made his eyes burn with tears that he angrily wiped away. He couldn't afford emotion now. He needed to remain focused, alert. Grief and guilt were luxuries for later if there was a later. By mid-morning, the temperature had risen considerably. The sun beat down on the thicket, and Jun-seong began to sweat despite the autumn chill in the air. He heard the distant sound of a motor and froze, every muscle tensing. The sound grew louder, and then he spotted a military truck moving along a dirt road about half a kilometer to the north. The truck passed without slowing, and gradually the sound of its engine faded into the distance. Jun-seong released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Around noon, Jun-seong heard voices faint but distinct. He couldn't see the speakers from his position, but they seemed to be somewhere off to his left, perhaps several hundred meters away. He listened intently, trying to determine if they were approaching his position or moving away. The voices faded gradually, and he concluded they had been passing through the area rather than searching it. Still, the encounter left him shaken. The coastal zone was more active than he had hoped. As the afternoon wore into evening, Jun-seong forced himself to eat. He had brought only minimal food, 2 rice balls wrapped in cloth, now somewhat crushed from being in his pocket during the long walk. He ate them slowly, methodically, trying to extract maximum sustenance from the meager provisions. He had no idea when or if he would eat again. Around 6 o'clock, with the sun beginning to set, Jun-seong carefully emerged from his hiding place and began his approach to the water. The tide had turned, and he could see that the mudflats were now partially covered. Moving carefully from one patch of vegetation to the next, constantly scanning for any sign of observation posts or patrols, he made his way toward the coast. The terrain was treacherous. The mud was deeper than he had anticipated, and several times he sank up to his knees, requiring exhausting effort to extract himself. The physical exertion, combined with the need to move quietly and remain constantly alert, drained his remaining energy rapidly. By the time he reached a position about 50 meters from the water's edge, he was gasping for breath and trembling with exhaustion. From this closer vantage point, Jun-seong could see the full challenge that faced him. The coast here was not a clean beach but a maze of mudflats, tidal channels, and rocky outcroppings. The water itself appeared dark and forbidding in the fading light. The Yellow Sea, he knew from his training, was notoriously dangerous. The tides were strong and unpredictable, the water was cold enough to induce hypothermia within an hour. And the currents could easily carry an exhausted swimmer far off course. But even more daunting than the natural hazards was the security infrastructure. Jun-seong could now see, positioned along the coast at irregular intervals, the watchtowers he had known would be there. They were spaced far enough apart that there were gaps in coverage, but close enough that anyone in the water would likely be spotted if the guards were alert. Most of the towers were equipped with powerful searchlights that could illuminate vast expanses of water. Some, he knew, also had thermal imaging equipment, though such technology was expensive and might not be installed in all positions. As full darkness fell, Jun-seong made his decision. He couldn't wait any longer. Every hour he remained on North Korean soil increased the chances that the search for him had begun, that his description had been circulated, that roadblocks were being established, and coastal patrols intensified. He had to move now, while darkness provided some cover, and hope that luck and the sea would carry him to safety. He removed his shoes and tied them together, then hung them around his neck. The shoes were one of the few items he had that might be useful in South Korea, and he was reluctant to abandon them. He emptied his pockets of everything except a small waterproof bag containing his Bowibu identification card. He thought this might be valuable to South Korean intelligence, and the remaining bottle of water. Though he knew the water would likely be lost once he entered the sea. Jun-seong took a deep breath and began moving toward the water. The mud sucked at his feet with each step, making progress slow and exhausting. The water, when he finally reached it, was shockingly cold. He gasped as it touched his legs, and for a moment he hesitated. The temperature alone could kill him. Hypothermia would set in quickly, gradually robbing him of strength and coordination. Until he could no longer swim, until he simply sank beneath the dark water and drowned. But behind him was certain death, arrest, torture, execution, and the destruction of his family. Ahead, in the cold dark water, was at least the possibility of survival. Jun-seong waded deeper, feeling the bottom drop away beneath his feet. When the water reached his chest, he pushed off and began to swim. The cold was immediately overwhelming. It felt as though icy hands were squeezing his chest, making it difficult to breathe. His muscles seemed to seize up, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might simply sink. But years of mandatory military training kicked in, and he forced himself into a steady, energy-conserving stroke. South. He had to keep moving south. Every meter he swam took him closer to South Korean territorial waters and farther from the reach of the regime he had served for so long. After perhaps 20 minutes of swimming, though time became difficult to measure in the darkness and cold, Jun-seong heard the sound of a motor. He stopped swimming and allowed himself to float, trying to make as little disturbance in the water as possible. A patrol boat appeared, its searchlight sweeping across the water perhaps 200 meters to his east. Jun-seong held his breath, certain he would be spotted, that the light would fix on him and that would be the end. But the boat continued on its patrol pattern, the light never quite reaching his position. The sound of the motor gradually faded, and Jun-seong resumed swimming. The struggle against the cold became his entire world. His arms and legs grew increasingly numb and unresponsive. His breathing became labored, each inhalation requiring conscious effort. Several times, waves washed over his head, and he swallowed mouthfuls of salt water that made him gag and cough. The shoes around his neck became unbearably heavy, dragging at him, but he couldn't bring himself to let them go. They were a connection to his former life, a tangible reminder that he had once been someone, had once had an identity and a place in the world. Jun-seong had no way of knowing how far he had swum or whether he was even moving in the right direction. The darkness was complete, with only the stars above to provide any sense of orientation. He tried to keep the North Star to his left, which would mean he was heading generally south, but maintaining any consistent direction while fighting the current and the waves was nearly impossible. At some point he had lost all sense of time. Jun-seong realized he could no longer feel his arms and legs. He was still moving them, still swimming, but the sensation was gone. He knew this was a dangerous sign, an indication that hypothermia had progressed to a critical stage. He had perhaps another 30 minutes, maybe an hour, before his body would simply shut down. The thought should have terrified him, but instead he felt a strange calm. He had done everything he could. The outcome was now beyond his control. If he died here, at least he would die as a free man, not as a prisoner awaiting execution in some dark cell. It was this thought that he was already free, that by entering these waters he had escaped the physical boundaries of the regime. Even if he never reached the south, that gave him the strength to continue. He swam on, each stroke an act of defiance, each breath a declaration of independence from the system that had defined his entire existence. And then, through the darkness and the waves, Jun-seong saw lights. At first, he thought he was hallucinating, that his oxygen-deprived brain was conjuring false hope. But the lights remained, and they were different from the North Korean patrol lights he had seen earlier. These were steadier, brighter, arranged in patterns that suggested buildings and infrastructure. Civilization. Safety. The South. New energy surged through Jun-seong's failing body. He swam toward the lights with renewed determination, no longer caring about conserving energy or maintaining stealth. The lights grew closer, and he could now see that they illuminated a coastline with what appeared to be a small port or military installation. He was close, so close. Just a little farther. Suddenly, a powerful spotlight fixed on him, blinding him with its intensity. Jun-seong heard shouting, but he couldn't understand the words. Was it Korean? Was it the South? Or had he somehow circled back and was about to be captured by Northern forces? He tried to shout, to identify himself, but his voice came out as barely a croak. He had nothing left. The next minutes were a confused blur. There were boats, voices, hands pulling him from the water. He felt himself being lifted, wrapped in something warm. Someone was speaking to him in Korean, but the dialect was different, the intonation softer than what he was used to. "You're safe now," a voice said. "You're in South Korea. You made it." Jun-seong tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The accumulated exhaustion, fear, and cold had finally overwhelmed him. As consciousness began to slip away, his last thought was of his daughter. He had survived. Against all odds, he had crossed the deadly waters and reached freedom. But the price of that freedom was a loss so profound that even in his semi-conscious state, it brought tears to his eyes. When Jun-seong next opened his eyes, he was in a hospital bed. The room was brightly lit, with white walls and modern medical equipment that beeped softly beside him. A South Korean doctor, he realized with a start, was checking his vital signs. The doctor noticed he was awake and smiled gently. "Welcome to the Republic of Korea," the doctor said. "You've been asleep for almost 18 hours. You had severe hypothermia, but you're going to be fine. You're safe now." Safe. The word seemed almost meaningless to Jun-seong. Yes, his body was safe, rescued from the cold sea that had nearly claimed his life. But what about his mind, his soul, the parts of him that he had left behind in that dark apartment in Kaesong? What about the family he had abandoned, the life he had destroyed with his decision to seek freedom? Was any of that safe? Would any of it ever be safe again? But even as these questions tormented him, Jun-seong felt something else, a sensation so unfamiliar that it took him a moment to identify it. It was hope. Fragile, tentative, mixed with grief and guilt, but unmistakably hopeful. And he had crossed the tempestuous West Sea. He had survived the impossible. And now, in this clean, bright room in a free country, he had the opportunity to become something new, to build a life based not on the lies he had once enforced, but on the truth he had been willing to die to discover. The journey across the sea had taken only a few hours, but it had carried him across a gulf wider than any physical distance from one world to another. From captivity to freedom, from the person he had been to the person he might yet become. Jun-seong closed his eyes, exhausted but alive, and allowed himself to rest in the strange, almost unbearable lightness of being free. The Ministry of Unification's Resettlement Support Center for North Korean refugees, known colloquially as Hanawon, sits in a quiet valley in Ansong, Gyeonggi Province, approximately 80 kilometers south of Seoul. When Jun-seong first arrived there in mid-October 2019, 3 weeks after his harrowing crossing of the Yellow Sea, he experienced a profound sense of dislocation. The facility resembled a small university campus, modern buildings arranged around courtyards, walking paths lined with trees, displaying their autumn colors, and an atmosphere that seemed almost impossibly peaceful compared to the constant tension that had characterized his life in the north. The initial weeks following his rescue had been a blur of debriefings, medical examinations, and psychological assessments. Immediately after his recovery from hypothermia, Jun-seong had been transferred to a secure facility operated by the National Intelligence Service. There, he had undergone extensive questioning by teams of intelligence officers who wanted to know everything about his background, his work in the political security department, his knowledge of North Korean security apparatus, and the circumstances of his defection. These sessions had been exhausting and, at times, deeply uncomfortable. Jun-seong had to relive his decision to betray his country, though he no longer thought of it as betrayal but as escape, and to provide detailed information about his former colleagues, including Kim Tae-il. The intelligence officers had been particularly interested in Tae-il's fate and what information he might reveal under interrogation. Jun-seong had told them everything he knew, but the guilt of potentially contributing to further harm to his friend weighed heavily on him. The officers had also been very interested in Jun-seong's assessment of internal conditions in North Korea, the morale of security personnel, and any information he possessed about the regime's stability and vulnerabilities. As a former political security department officer, his insights were considered valuable. He had cooperated fully, partly out of genuine desire to assist his new country, and partly out of a need to prove his loyalty and worth. He was acutely aware that as a former enforcer of the regime, he would be viewed with some suspicion. He needed to demonstrate that his transformation was genuine, that he had truly rejected his former life. Throughout these weeks of debriefing, Jun-seong had been kept in relative isolation. He had limited contact with other defectors and no access to the outside world. The isolation had been difficult, giving him too much time to think about what he had left behind. At night, lying in his small room at the intelligence facility, he was haunted by thoughts of his family. What had happened to them after his disappearance? Had his wife been arrested? Was his daughter being punished for his crimes? The not knowing was a special kind of torture, worse in some ways than physical pain. His arrival at Hanawon in October had marked a transition from the security-focused phase of his defection to the resettlement phase. Hanawon's primary purpose was to prepare North Korean defectors for life in South Korean society, a task that proved far more complex and challenging than Jun-seong had initially imagined. The program lasted 12 weeks and covered everything from basic life skills to cultural orientation, from psychological counseling to vocational training. Jun-seong's first impression of Hanawon's facilities had been one of overwhelming abundance. The dormitory where he was assigned a room had amenities that would have been luxuries even for high-ranking officials in the north. Each room, shared by 2 residents, had its own bathroom with a shower that provided hot water at any time of day or night. The heating system worked consistently, maintaining a comfortable temperature regardless of the weather outside. There were electrical outlets in every room, and the electricity never went off. These seemingly mundane details represented a level of infrastructure reliability that Jun-seong had never experienced. But it was the dining hall that had first truly shocked him. On his first evening at Hanawon, Jun-seong had joined the other residents for dinner. The hall was large and brightly lit, with dozens of tables arranged in neat rows. But what had stopped him in his tracks was the food service area. It was arranged as a buffet, with multiple stations offering different types of food: Korean dishes, Western-style options, vegetarian selections, and various side dishes. Residents could take as much food as they wanted, and the variety was staggering. There were fresh vegetables, multiple types of meat, fish, tofu dishes, soups, rice, noodles, and an entire section devoted to desserts and fresh fruit. Jun-seong had stood frozen, staring at the abundance, until another resident, a woman in her 40s who had arrived at Hanawon several weeks earlier, had gently touched his arm. "It's overwhelming at first, isn't it?" she had said quietly. "I cried the first time I saw it. All this food, just available, as much as you want. No ration cards, no waiting in line for hours, no wondering if there will be anything left by the time you reach the front." Her name was Park Mi-sun, and she had defected from Chongjin, in North Hamgyong Province, along with her teenage son. She had worked as a market trader in the north, and her relatively successful business had given her access to information about the outside world through her contacts with Chinese merchants. When her son had been caught with a USB drive containing South Korean music videos, she had used her savings and connections to arrange their escape through China, eventually reaching South Korea via Thailand. Her journey had taken 8 months and had involved hardships that made Jun-seong's sea crossing seem almost simple by comparison. Mi-sun had appointed herself as Jun-seong's informal guide during his first weeks at Hanawon. She had been through the initial shock and adjustment period and understood the psychological challenges that new arrivals faced. "The abundance is wonderful," she had told him during one of their early conversations, "but it's also disorienting. In the north, we were always calculating how to stretch food supplies, how to save electricity, how to make everything last because we never knew when we might get more. Here, that kind of calculation isn't necessary, but our minds don't know how to stop doing it." Jun-seong had found her insights valuable, but he had also been careful about how much he revealed about his own background. He had told the Hanawon staff about his former position in the political security department, as he was required to do. But he had been vague with other residents about his work in the north, describing himself simply as a government employee. He was acutely aware that many of the people at Hanawon had suffered because of officials like him. Some might have been interrogated by the Bowibu, might have had family members imprisoned because of investigations he or his colleagues had conducted. The thought filled him with shame, and he kept his distance from most residents, participating in required activities but avoiding deeper social connections. The educational program at Hanawon was intensive and comprehensive. Each day was structured with classes and activities designed to prepare defectors for life in a market economy and democratic society. Jun-seong attended courses on South Korean history and government, learning a version of the Korean War's history that was radically different from what he had been taught in the north. He took classes on basic economics, learning about capitalism, banking, credit, and personal finance management. He studied South Korean social norms and etiquette, discovering that many behaviors he had considered normal were viewed as odd or inappropriate in the South. One of the most challenging classes was the technology orientation. The course introduced residents to smartphones, computers, and the Internet technologies that existed in the north, but were tightly controlled and available only to a privileged few. For Jun-seong, who had used computers in his work, the basic operations weren't entirely foreign. But the Internet was a revelation that dwarfed even the shock of the foreign media he had watched in the north. During one of the computer lab sessions in early November, an instructor demonstrated how to use a search engine. "You can search for any information you want," the instructor explained. "Any topic, any question. The results appear in seconds." To demonstrate, she asked the class to suggest topics. Someone asked about the weather in Pyongyang. Within seconds, detailed weather information appeared: current temperature, forecast for the next week, historical weather data. Someone else asked about the price of rice in Seoul. Again, immediate results showing current market prices at various locations throughout the city. Jun-seong had felt something close to vertigo. In the north, information was controlled, parceled out by the state, and often limited to what the authorities deemed appropriate for citizens to know. Basic facts, weather patterns, commodity prices, news from other countries were either unavailable or filtered through the lens of state propaganda. Here, all of it was instantly accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The implications were staggering. Later that day, during a free period, Jun-seong returned to the computer lab and, with trembling hands, typed his own name into the search engine. He had half expected to find nothing, or perhaps a mention in South Korean intelligence reports that wouldn't be publicly accessible. Instead, he found news articles about recent defections from North Korea, including some that mentioned a high-ranking security official who had crossed by sea in late September. The articles didn't name him specifically, but he recognized his own story. The fact that information about his defection was publicly available, that journalists had written about it, that anyone could read about it, this openness was both thrilling and terrifying. On impulse, he searched for information about his hometown, Kaesong. He found photographs of the city, historical articles about the Kaesong industrial complex, and news reports about border tensions in the region. He found a Wikipedia article. The instructor had explained this as a collaborative encyclopedia that anyone could edit about Kaesong's history, geography, and culture. The article contained more objective information about his hometown than he had ever been able to access while living there. Then, his heart pounding, Jun-seong searched for information about the Political Security Department. He found articles describing the organization's role in maintaining the regime's control, reports from human rights organizations documenting abuses committed by the Bowibu, and testimony from defectors about their experiences being interrogated and imprisoned. He read descriptions of the very practices he had once participated in, now labeled as human rights violations and crimes against humanity. The shame was overwhelming. He closed the browser and left the computer lab, feeling physically ill. That evening, Mi's son found him sitting alone in one of the courtyard gardens, staring at nothing. She sat down beside him without asking permission, a familiarity that Jun-seong had come to appreciate. "You learned something about yourself today," she said. It wasn't a question. Jun-seong nodded slowly. "I've been reading about the things I used to do. The work I used to consider necessary and even noble. Reading how the rest of the world sees it." Mi's son was quiet for a moment. "We all carry guilt," she said finally. "Maybe not the same as yours, but guilt nonetheless. I informed on my neighbors, sometimes small things. Violations of market regulations because it kept the authorities' attention away from my own illegal activities. I told myself it was survival, but people suffered because of what I reported. We all made compromises to survive in that system. The question now is what we do with that knowledge, how we move forward." Her words provided some comfort, though they didn't erase Jun-seong's guilt. Over the following weeks, as the Hanawon program continued, he began to see his situation in a slightly different light. Yes, he had been an agent of oppression. But he had also been, in his own way, a victim of the system raised from birth in a society built on lies. Trained to believe that his actions served a greater good, and given no access to information that might have allowed him to question those beliefs earlier. His eventual rejection of the system, his willingness to risk everything for truth and freedom, couldn't erase his past actions. But perhaps it could represent a form of atonement, the beginning of a different kind of life. The Hanawon program also included group counseling sessions led by psychologists who specialized in working with North Korean defectors. These sessions addressed the trauma of defection. The guilt associated with leaving family members behind, and the challenges of adapting to a radically different society. Jun-seong found these sessions difficult. Talking about his emotions had never been encouraged in the North, where any display of vulnerability could be interpreted as weakness or lack of revolutionary spirit. But gradually, with the encouragement of the counselor and the example of other residents who shared their own struggles, he began to open up. During one session in mid-November, the counselor asked each participant to describe the moment when they truly understood they were free. One woman described walking into a bookstore in Seoul and realizing she could buy any book she wanted without permission or fear of punishment. Another resident described the first time he publicly expressed disagreement with something a government official had said, waiting for retaliation that never came. When the question reached Jun-seong, he thought carefully before responding. "It was in the dining hall here," he said slowly. "My third or fourth day at Hanawon. I was getting food, and I realized I had to make a choice between japchae and bibimbap. It was a trivial choice, meaningless really. But I stood there, paralyzed, because I suddenly understood that the choice was entirely mine. No one would judge me for choosing one over the other. There was no correct answer, no political implication. It was just a choice. And I could make it based on nothing more than what I felt like eating at that moment." He paused, aware that others in the group were nodding in understanding. In the North, every choice what to wear, what to say, where to work, how to live was either mandated or constrained by ideology and survival calculations. Freedom, I realized in that moment, isn't about grand political rights or abstract principles. It's about the accumulation of small, personal choices. It's about being able to decide what to eat for dinner based on nothing more than your own preference. That's when I truly understood that I was free. My son, who was also in the group session, reached over and squeezed his hand. The gesture surprised him. Physical affection was not common in the North outside of immediate family, but he didn't pull away. Over the weeks at Hanawon, my son had become something more than a guide or friend. They shared a bond forged by their common experience of defection, by the unique understanding of what it meant to abandon everything familiar for the unknown. They had begun spending more time together, taking walks in the facility's gardens, sharing meals, talking late into the night about their hopes and fears for the future. Jun-seong found himself drawn to my son's strength and resilience. She had endured enormous hardships, not just the dangerous journey to the south, but years of struggle in the North as a single mother after her husband had died in a mining accident. Yet she maintained an optimism and forward-looking perspective that Jun-seong found both admirable and healing. She didn't dwell on what had been lost, but focused on what might be gained. She was already making plans for her life after Hanawon. She wanted to continue working in trade, perhaps opening a small shop, and was taking every vocational training opportunity the program offered. "You should think about what you want to do," she told Jun-seong during one of their walks in late November, as the first snow of winter began to fall. "You have skills, experience, and education. The government provides support for defectors starting businesses or getting additional education. What do you want your new life to look like?" It was a question Jun-seong had been avoiding. His entire life in the North had been defined by the state, his education directed toward serving the regime, his career assigned rather than chosen, his future predetermined by his position and songbun classification. The idea that he could now choose his own path was simultaneously liberating and overwhelming. "I don't know," he admitted. "Everything I knew how to do was in service of a system I now reject. How do I take those skills and apply them to something constructive rather than destructive?" My son considered this. "You understand how authoritarian systems work, how information is controlled, how people are manipulated and oppressed. Maybe there's value in that understanding. Maybe you could help other defectors, use your knowledge to assist in reunification efforts, or work with human rights organizations. Your past doesn't have to define your future, but maybe it can inform it. Her suggestion planted a seed in Jun-seong's mind. Over the remaining weeks of the Hanawon program, he began to envision a possible future. He could use his understanding of North Korean society and the regime's mechanisms of control to help others who were making the transition he was now undergoing. He could be a bridge, someone who understood both worlds and could help translate between them, could help newly arrived defectors navigate the enormous cultural and psychological challenges they faced. As the Hanawon program entered its final weeks in December 2019, Jun-seong participated in job preparation activities. He attended workshops on resume writing, job interviews, and workplace culture in South Korea. He learned about the discrimination that many North Korean defectors faced in the job market, where their accents, educational backgrounds, and gaps in technological knowledge often put them at a disadvantage. He learned about the support systems available, government subsidies, special educational programs, and nonprofit organizations dedicated to helping defectors succeed in South Korean society. On his final day at Hanawon, in mid-December, Jun-seong stood in the room he had occupied for the past 12 weeks, packing his few belongings. The room that had initially seemed so luxurious now felt familiar and comfortable. He was nervous about leaving, about stepping out into South Korean society without the structured support and protection of the facility. But he was also hopeful. He had a small government-subsidized apartment waiting for him in Seoul. A modest settlement payment that would sustain him for several months, and a plan still vague but taking shape for how he might build a meaningful life in his new country. Mi-sun knocked on his open door. She had graduated from the program 2 weeks earlier but had returned to Hanawon for a final visit. "Ready to face the world?" she asked with a smile. Jun-seong smiled back, a genuine smile, the first he could remember in months. "As ready as I'll ever be," he said. "Though I suspect that no amount of preparation could truly ready someone for this." "Probably not," Mi-sun agreed. "But we don't have to face it alone. I was thinking my apartment isn't far from yours in Seoul. Maybe we could meet regularly, help each other adjust. And maybe," she paused, suddenly looking uncertain, "maybe it could be more than just mutual support. If you wanted. There's no pressure, but I wanted you to know that I care about you, and I'd like to see where this might go." Jun-seong felt a warmth spread through his chest. In the North, romantic relationships were pragmatic arrangements, often influenced by considerations of songbun, political reliability, and practical compatibility. The idea that two people might choose to be together simply because they cared for each other, without requiring approval from work units or party officials, was another small freedom that he was still learning to appreciate. "I'd like that very much," he said quietly. "I'd like that very much indeed." As they left Hanawon together that December afternoon, stepping out into a cold but clear winter day, Jun-seong felt something he hadn't experienced since the night he had walked away from his apartment in Kaesong. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival that had sustained him through the cold waters of the Yellow Sea, but a quieter, more sustainable hope. The hope that he could build something new from the ruins of his old life. The hope that freedom, with all its challenges and responsibilities, was a gift worth the terrible price he had paid. The hope that his future, for the first time in his life, was truly his own to shape. The winter of early 2020 brought an unusual quiet to Seoul. Jun-seong had settled into his small government-subsidized apartment in the Hanawon district of northern Seoul, a neighborhood known for its relatively high concentration of North Korean defectors. The apartment was modest by South Korean standards, a single room with a tiny kitchen alcove and a bathroom, but to Jun-seong, it represented a luxury he was still learning to process. The heating worked reliably, hot water was available at any hour, and the electricity never failed. These basic amenities, which South Koreans took entirely for granted, remained small miracles to him even months after his defection. From his fifth-floor window, Jun-seong could see a slice of Seoul's endless urban landscape, apartment buildings stretching toward the horizon, interspersed with commercial districts whose neon signs blazed through the night. In the distance, he could make out the dark outline of mountains that ringed the city. Sometimes, in the evening, he would stand at the window and simply watch the lights, marveling at the sheer abundance of electricity that kept millions of lights burning without interruption. In Pyongyang, even in the most privileged neighborhoods, such constant illumination was impossible. Here, it was so ordinary that no one even remarked on it. The early weeks of 2020 had been a period of intense adjustment. Jun-seong had initially struggled with even simple tasks like grocery shopping. The first time he had entered a supermarket in Seoul, he had been overwhelmed by the scale and variety. Entire aisles were devoted to products he had never seen or couldn't identify, dozens of varieties of instant noodles, coffee in countless forms and flavors, cleaning products with specialized purposes he couldn't fathom. He had stood paralyzed in the produce section, staring at fruits he didn't recognize, unable to make even basic decisions about what to buy. An elderly woman shopping nearby had noticed his confusion and had kindly offered help. "First time shopping alone?" she had asked, her tone gentle rather than judgmental. When Jun-seong had nodded, she had smiled knowingly. "My nephew came from the north 5 years ago. I remember he had the same overwhelmed look. Here, let me show you some basics." She had walked him through the store, explaining how to read price labels, which products offered the best value, and how to use the self-checkout machines that were becoming increasingly common. Her casual kindness, offered to a stranger without expectation of anything in return, had moved Jun-seong nearly to tears. These small acts of human decency, the grocery store woman, the bus driver who had patiently explained the transportation card system, the neighbor who had knocked on his door to welcome him to the building, accumulated into a revelation about South Korean society. In the North, Jun-seong had been taught that capitalist societies were fundamentally selfish, that the competition inherent in market economies destroyed human solidarity and compassion. Yet he found the opposite to be true. While South Korean society certainly had its problems and inequalities, he observed a baseline level of mutual consideration and voluntary cooperation that seemed entirely at odds with the propaganda he had been fed for 37 years. Mi Sun had been instrumental in his adjustment during these early months. True to her word, she had maintained regular contact after they had both left Hanawon. They met several times a week, sometimes for meals, just to walk through the city together and share their observations and struggles. Mi Sun had an easier time adapting in some ways. Her years as a market trader in the North had given her practical skills and a certain psychological flexibility that served her well in capitalist society. She had quickly found work at a small import-export company whose owner had a policy of hiring North Korean defectors, and she was already saving money toward her goal of eventually opening her own business. Their relationship had deepened gradually and naturally. In late January 2020, they had attended a gathering organized by a support organization for North Korean defectors. The event, held in a community center in Seoul, had brought together several dozen defectors for a meal and social activities. Jun-seong had been nervous about attending, still uncomfortable in large social gatherings and anxious about how he would be received if people learned about his former position in the political security department. But the evening had been surprisingly pleasant. The attendees represented a cross-section of North Korean society: former factory workers, teachers, soldiers, farmers, and even a few former low-level party officials. They shared stories about their defection experiences, their challenges in adapting to South Korean society, and their hopes for the future. Jun-seong had been struck by the absence of judgment or hierarchy. In the North, people's social interactions were heavily influenced by their songbun classification and party status. Here, a former party member and a former farmer spoke as equals, their shared experience of defection, creating a bond that transcended the rigid social structures they had left behind. During that evening, Jun-seong had finally opened up about his background to a small group that included Mi Sun and several other defectors. He had explained, with considerable difficulty and shame, that he had worked for the political security department, that he had been involved in investigations and interrogations, that he bore responsibility for the suffering of others. The silence that had followed his confession had been excruciating. Then an older man, a former teacher from Hanawon, had spoken. "We all carry guilt about what we did to survive in that system," he had said quietly. "I informed on colleagues who expressed even mild criticism of the regime. I taught children lies about history and filled their minds with propaganda. I participated in the public denunciation sessions where neighbors were ritually humiliated. Was any of that less harmful than what you did? We were all part of the machine, whether we wore a Bowibu uniform or not. What matters now is what we do with our freedom, how we choose to live now that we have the opportunity to choose." His words had been echoed by others in the group. A former soldier described participating in border patrols where he had been ordered to shoot defectors on site orders. He had followed until his own circumstances had changed and he had become a defector himself. A woman who had worked in a garment factory described being forced to report on her co-workers' private conversations, living in constant fear that her own words might be similarly reported. The cumulative testimony painted a picture of a society so thoroughly corrupted by totalitarianism that no one emerged with clean hands, where survival itself required moral compromises that would haunt people for the rest of their lives. Jun-seong had left that gathering feeling simultaneously worse and better. Worse, because hearing others describe their complicity had reinforced the systemic nature of the evil he had participated in. It wasn't just a few bad individuals, but an entire society structured around oppression and mutual surveillance. Better, because he realized he wasn't uniquely monstrous, that his guilt was shared by virtually everyone who had lived under the regime, and that the path forward wasn't to be paralyzed by shame but to use his experience to create something positive. This realization had crystallized into a concrete plan by February 2020. Jun-seong had been meeting regularly with a counselor specializing in defector resettlement, and during one of their sessions, he had articulated his growing sense of purpose. "I want to help other defectors," he had said. "I want to use my understanding of how the North Korean system works, the psychology of control, the mechanisms of oppression, the way information is manipulated to help people process their experiences and adapt to life here. I was part of the machine that crushed people's spirits. Maybe I can be part of a different machine now, one that helps rebuild them." The counselor, a woman named Drive Seo, who had been working with North Korean defectors for over a decade, had leaned forward with interest. "That's a meaningful goal," she had said. "And there's certainly a need. Many defectors struggle not just with practical adaptation but with psychological and identity issues. Someone who deeply understands the system they escaped from, who can articulate those mechanisms and help people process their experiences, that would be valuable." Have you thought about what form this work might take? Jun-seong had explained his preliminary thinking. He wanted to pursue additional education, perhaps enrolling in courses related to counseling, social work, or human rights. He wanted to volunteer with organizations that supported defectors, gradually building experience and connections. And he had a more ambitious idea that was still taking shape in his mind. Creating an online platform, a website, or even a mobile application that would serve as an information hub for North Korean defectors. The internet is a tool we never had access to in the North, he had explained to Dr. Seo. Most defectors arrive here with minimal digital literacy, and the learning curve is steep. What if there were a platform specifically designed for us? It could provide practical information about navigating South Korean systems, how to use healthcare, how to apply for jobs, how to access educational opportunities. But it could also be a community space where defectors could share experiences, ask questions, and support each other. And it could include educational content about the outside world, helping people fill in the enormous gaps in knowledge that we all have when we arrive. Dr. Seo had been enthusiastic about the concept. That kind of centralized resource could be tremendously valuable, she had agreed. There are various organizations and government programs that provide support, but the information is scattered and often difficult for defectors to find. And the community aspect you mentioned, the ability to connect with others who share your experience, that's something many defectors deeply need but struggle to find. She had promised to introduce Jun-seong to people in the NGO sector who might be able to help him develop his ideas. By March 2020, as news of a novel coronavirus spreading from China began to dominate South Korean media, Jun-seong had taken concrete steps toward his goals. He had enrolled in online courses in basic counseling techniques, and had begun volunteering 3 days a week at a community center that provided services to North Korean defectors. His responsibilities were initially simple, helping people fill out forms, explaining how to navigate government websites, assisting with job applications, but the work felt meaningful in a way that nothing in his previous life had. Through his volunteer work, Jun-seong encountered countless individuals whose stories reinforced his sense of purpose. There was Kim Sung-min, a man in his 50s who had been a mid-level party official in Pyongyang before defecting through China. Sung-min struggled with intense shame about his privileged position in the North and his participation in a system he now recognized as evil. Jun-seong spent hours talking with him, sharing his own struggles with guilt and helping Sung-min understand that self-flagellation wasn't productive. What mattered was how they used their knowledge and experience now. There was Lee Jun-seong, a woman in her 30s who had been separated from her children during her escape. She had fled with her 2 sons, ages 7 and 9, leaving behind her husband, who had refused to defect. During their dangerous journey through China, the boys had been temporarily separated from her, and had been repatriated to North Korea before she could recover them. She had eventually reached South Korea alone and now lived with the unbearable knowledge that her children were likely in a political prison camp being punished for her escape. Jung-hee's grief was so profound that she could barely function, and Jun-seong found himself inadequate to the task of comforting her. What words could address such a loss? Yet he sat with her, week after week, bearing witness to her pain because that was all he could offer. There was Park Jin-ho, a teenager who had been born in China to a North Korean mother who had fled during the famine of the 1990s. Jin-ho had lived stateless in China until Chinese authorities discovered his family and began threatening deportation to North Korea, forcing him and his mother to flee again to South Korea. Jin-ho spoke Mandarin better than Korean and struggled to connect with his mother's culture and identity. Jun-seong helped him with Korean language studies and tried to explain aspects of North Korean culture and psychology, serving as a bridge between Jin-ho's Chinese upbringing and his Korean heritage. Each person's story was unique, yet patterns emerged. Nearly everyone struggled with guilt about family members left behind, guilt about things done to survive in the North, guilt about enjoying freedoms and opportunities unavailable to those still trapped in the regime. Nearly everyone experienced profound culture shock, not just about technology or economics but about basic assumptions about human nature and society. And nearly everyone felt isolated and lonely, caught between two worlds, not fully comfortable in South Korea but unable to return to the North. Jun-seong's relationship with Mi Sun continued to deepen during this period. By April 2020, as South Korea implemented strict social distancing measures in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, it had begun discussing the possibility of marriage. The pandemic had actually brought them closer together as social gatherings became impossible, and many activities shut down. They had spent more time in each other's apartments, cooking meals together, watching television, and simply being present with each other. One evening in late April, as they shared a modest dinner in Jun-seong's apartment, Mi Sun had raised the subject directly. "We're both starting new lives," she had said. "Both trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage of what we left behind. I think we could build something together. A family, a partnership, a shared future. What do you think?" Jun-seong had been quiet for a long moment, thinking about his daughter in the North. Would she even remember him? Would she grow up hating him for his abandonment? The guilt was still raw, still painful. But Mi Sun was here, real and present, offering not just companionship but a chance to create something new. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't restore what had been lost. But perhaps he could honor it by building a different kind of future. "I think," he had said slowly, "that I would like that very much. I carry grief about what I've lost, and I suspect I always will. But grief and hope aren't mutually exclusive. I can mourn what was while still embracing what might be." They had married in a small ceremony in June 2020, attended by a handful of friends from the defector community and some of the social workers and volunteers who had helped them during their adjustment period. The ceremony had been simple, no elaborate traditional proceedings, no family members present to observe the formalities. But it had felt genuine and meaningful in a way that Jun's first marriage, arranged partly for career advancement and social compatibility within the North Korean system, had never been. By the summer of 2020, Jun-seong had made significant progress on his platform idea. With Dr. Seo's help, he had connected with a small NGO that supported North Korean defectors and had received a modest grant to develop a prototype website. He had also met with several computer science students at a Seoul university who were interested in social impact projects. And they had agreed to help with the technical development in exchange for the experience and the opportunity to contribute to a meaningful cause. The platform, which they had tentatively named Sabit, New Light, was designed to be comprehensive yet user-friendly. It featured several main sections: a practical information hub with step-by-step guides for accessing various services in South Korea, a community forum where defectors could ask questions and share experiences, a resource directory listing support organizations and services, and an educational section with articles and videos explaining aspects of South Korean society, technology, and culture. Jun-seong had been particularly focused on the educational content. He had begun writing articles himself, drawing on his own experience of discovering and processing information about the outside world. He wrote about how to use search engines effectively, how to evaluate the credibility of online information, and how to understand news media in a free society where multiple perspectives and rather than a single official narrative dominate. He wrote about the psychological challenges of adaptation, using his understanding of how totalitarian systems shaped thinking patterns to help others recognize and overcome the mental habits that served them poorly in a free society. The project had given Jun-seong a renewed sense of purpose. On difficult days when he was overwhelmed by guilt about his past or grief about his lost family, he focused on the work. Every article he wrote, every resource he compiled, every feature added to the platform was a small act of redemption. He couldn't undo his past actions, couldn't restore what he had destroyed. But he could use his knowledge and experience to help others navigate the transition he was still undergoing himself. By the autumn of 2020, Sabit had launched in beta form and had begun attracting users. The initial response had been modest but encouraging. A few dozen defectors had registered and begun using the forums and resources. Jun-seong monitored the site obsessively, reading every post, responding to questions, and continually refining and improving the platform based on user feedback. He had also begun conducting workshops at the community center where he volunteered, teaching basic digital literacy skills and introducing newly arrived defectors to the platform. One afternoon in October, Jun-seong received a message through the Sabit platform that would profoundly affect him. It was from a defector who identified himself only as traveler, and who wrote that he had arrived in South Korea just 3 weeks earlier, via the same route Jun-seong had taken, crossing the West Sea by swimming. "I read your story on this site," the message said, "and I wanted you to know that you were an inspiration. When I was in the water, freezing and terrified, ready to give up, I remembered reading about someone else who had made that same crossing. I told myself if one person could survive it, maybe I could too. Thank you for sharing your experience. It literally saved my life." Jun-seong had sat at his computer, tears streaming down his face as he read and reread the message. Here was tangible evidence that his efforts mattered, that his painful journey could serve a purpose beyond his own survival. He wrote back immediately, welcoming traveler to South Korea and offering whatever help and support he could provide. They arranged to meet in person the following week, and Jun-seong found himself looking forward to the encounter with an intensity that surprised him. That evening, he shared the message with Mi Sun. They were cooking dinner together in the small kitchen of their apartment. They had moved into a slightly larger place after getting married, a one-bedroom unit in the same building where Jun-seong had originally lived. As he read her the message, his voice breaking with emotion, Mi Sun put down the vegetables she was chopping and embraced him tightly. "This is your path forward," she said quietly. "This is how you transform your past into something meaningful. You can't undo what you did in the North. But you can use what you learned there, both the knowledge of how oppression works and the experience of breaking free from it, to help others. You can be a bridge, connecting two worlds, helping people cross from one to the other, not just physically but psychologically and culturally." Her words articulated something Jun-seong had been feeling but hadn't been able to fully express. He was a bridge, someone who understood both the North Korean system from the inside, having been one of its enforcers, and the South Korean system from the perspective of a newcomer still learning its rules and norms. His unique position, purchased at such terrible cost, gave him the ability to translate between these worlds, to help others navigate the crossing he had made. By late 2020, as the year that had transformed his life drew to a close, Jun-seong had developed a clear vision for his future. He planned to continue expanding Sabit, adding more features and resources as funding and volunteer help allowed. He wanted to pursue formal education in counseling or social work, building on his volunteer experience to eventually work professionally with North Korean defectors. And he had begun discussing with Mi Sun the possibility of starting a family, not to replace the daughter he had lost, which would be impossible, but to create new life and new hope, to affirm that the future held possibilities worth embracing despite the pain of the past. On New Year's Eve 2020, Jun-seong and Mi Sun joined several other defector couples for a small celebration in their apartment building's community room. As midnight approached and the group prepared to watch the ball drop on television, a Western tradition that South Korea had adopted, Jun-seong reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. Just 15 months earlier, he had been standing in the cold waters of the Yellow Sea, uncertain whether he would survive the next hour, let alone build a new life. Now he was surrounded by friends who shared his experience. Married to a woman he loved and who understood him in ways no one else could, and engaged in work that gave his life meaning and purpose. As the countdown to the new year began, Jun-seong took Mi Sun's hand. "To new beginnings," he whispered to her as the clock struck midnight and the room erupted in cheers and celebration. "To become bridges rather than walls. To use our freedom to help others find theirs." Mi Sun squeezed his hand and smiled through tears. "To new beginnings," she echoed. "And to the courage to build something beautiful from broken pieces." As fireworks exploded over Seoul, visible through the windows of the community room, Jun-seong looked out at the city that had become his home. Somewhere to the north, beyond the mountains and the fortified border, and the narrow strip of sea he had crossed at such cost, was the country of his birth and the family he would probably never see again. That loss would always be part of him, a permanent wound that would ache for the rest of his life. But here, in this room full of people who understood his journey because they had made similar journeys themselves, in this city that blazed with light and possibility, in this country that, for all its flaws, offered the fundamental freedom to choose one's own path, here was where his future lay. Not a future without pain or regret, but a future with purpose and hope. A future where he could be not an enforcer of oppression but a facilitator of freedom, not a destroyer of hope but a builder of bridges. Jun-seong smiled, squeezed his wife's hand once more, and turned to embrace the new year and all the unknown challenges and opportunities it would bring. His crossing of the West Sea had been just the first step of a much longer journey, the journey from who he had been to who he might yet become. And that journey, he now understood, would last the rest of his life. But it was a journey worth making, every difficult step of it, because it led toward light rather than darkness, toward freedom rather than captivity, toward hope rather than despair. The bridge he was building, connecting past and future, north and south, oppression and freedom, it would be constructed one connection at a time, one defector helped, one story shared, one act of understanding and compassion offered. It would be the work of a lifetime, but it was work that mattered. And in that mattering, in that purpose, Jun-seong had finally found something that the regime had tried to strip from him, but had ultimately failed to destroy: the fundamental human dignity that comes from choosing to serve not power, but people, not ideology but humanity, not the machine of oppression but the eternal human yearning for freedom and truth. As the new year began and the celebration continued around him, Lee Jun-seong, former political security officer, defector, survivor, husband, bridge builder, allowed himself to hope. And in that hope was the promise of redemption, not complete or final, but ongoing and real. The promise that matters, even from the darkest past, a meaningful future could be built. One choice, one connection, one bridge at a time.